Double Up is a game mode in TFT that has been very popular ever since its release back in set 6, and this game mode has been seeing small improvements each set since its introduction. However, set 8's mid-set glitched out seems to be the first set to have worsened Double Up and significantly reduced the enjoyment for players. And this is primarily due to the changes made to the Rune of Allegiance, a consumable item that allows teammates to send units to the other. With this mid-set update, the ability to send items using the rune was removed in an attempt to address the issue of funneling, a frankly toxic playstyle that was becoming more and more prevalent.
What's the funneling strat in Double Up? So everyone's talking about this, but what it is you basically play, like, the common one is brawlers on one team, duelists on the other, because duelists are the best rushdown comp. The brawler player gives all the items to the duelist player, and the duelist player, now you're facing somebody with like 6 or 8 duelists with double the items they should. They mow down the enemy and then reinforce the brawler player, and the brawler player takes forever, even with no items, because it's just a ton of health.
But this solution feels very drastic and completely changes the feel of Double Up with the ways you and your teammate can play around each other based on what each of you hit. I mean, they considered limiting it to just one item.
Just one item? That's the obvious solution. We want to be sure before we jump to the obvious solution, but that's kind of where we're looking at the moment.
This wouldn't have been nearly as drastic as the current iteration, and I have no idea why they decided to go with the much harsher choice. Maybe there was a time limitation, a game limitation, or a design limitation, and this could be remedied in the future, but as far as I'm aware, nothing has really been communicated and no one really has a clue as to what's going to be changed. But right now, Rune feels much worse because of how significantly the quality of interactions between teammates has dropped. You may be able to use the runes more often, but those sends just don't nearly have as much value as they did before because you could send items, spats, emblems, orn items, or even radiant items. The increased usage of the runes just isn't enough to make up for the hole left by no longer being able to share any items in any form. It did actually feel pretty good at the beginning of PBE, where the runes regenerated after just 2 rounds because you had a lot of options at your disposal. Maybe you could go for a win streak and use runes to 2-star your units, or maybe you both go for lost streaks and send underground units to the other. There were a lot of decisions that arose and it felt good because it enabled a lot more playstyles. Also, since runes regenerate when used and any blue runes transform into orange runes at 4-1, that means you're limited to just a single rune at a time and you cannot stack runes on your bench anymore. So to get value early, you should be using your runes as much as possible, but this is pretty terrible, especially when you have nothing to send and you probably won't be rolling early game, so you can just go through the entire early game and not hit units your teammate needs. At least before, if you didn't use the runes, they would stack and you could go for a late game play when you're in a better spot to roll. This change also brings up another issue. One teammate may have made specific items for a particular unit, and maybe later, due to augments or rolls, the other teammate can use that particular unit better. Of course, the teammate wants to send this unit, but with the rune changes, the items won't be sent along with the unit. So one teammate has extra items they don't need, while the other didn't spike in ball strength as much as they needed to. In TFT, the items can be just as important as the unit itself, if not more so. So holding onto the items and sending the unit can actually weaken both teams. Without runes, there's not really much interaction between players and it just doesn't feel like a team game anymore, even though it's Double Up. It's like you're playing normal mode but with someone you share HP with. When you take away runes, realistically all that's left that makes Double Up different from normal are the gift armories, which I also have a lot of problems with. Gift Armouries are a mechanic in Double Up that allows you to provide your teammate with a power boost through extra items, gold, or units. Now the first issue I have with Gift Armouries is that they can be unequal from teammate to teammate, as each teammate can get a different selection of choices which can vary in power. And this is problematic because it can cause a power imbalance between teammates, which can then cause power imbalances between teams as a whole. Here's an example. Let's suppose your board is weaker than your teammates because they had an underground cash out or you're low rolling, and there's another team in a similar situation. If the weaker player on the other team gets the stronger gift armory and you don't, it's really bad for you because their team becomes stronger overall and yours doesn't, and this has the power to swing matchups. The gift armories need to be equal from teammate to teammate because right now it creates a weird dynamic where one teammate can be forced to play from behind, knowing that their enemy will be reinforced because their board is so weak and that they won't reinforce their teammates. Basically, you can't play around gift armories as much as you should be able to because you don't know what you'll get until it's shown to you. And this is significantly different to augments, as augments are tailored to your board. For gift armories to exist in their current state, there needs to be more ways to distribute the power to your teammates, so in the case that you get something you can't use, you will at least have the option to give it to your teammates. But they removed item sharing, so that's a big no to sending things like Ornn items or Radiant items, which makes gift armories feel even worse. There just isn't enough player agency over this mechanic anymore, and I personally would love having more because removing gift armories definitely isn't the solution. I think gift armories are necessary in double up because before them, double up could be very stagnant and drawn out because there weren't many ways for boards to get stronger in their late game. This also led to situations where, because of the lack of power spikes, someone could keep sitting on loads of econ, not get heavily punished for it, and push levels and roll for 3-star 4 or 5 costs, which would completely throw the game off for everyone else. If gift armories and item sharing were removed, would that make double up any different from the normal game mode? Of course, the armories may become meaningless if everyone gets the same options and the same spike, but it's a spike nonetheless. With runes, the exchange of items and units from the armories felt much more like actual gifts because you're losing something that your teammate gains. And as it turns out, there's actually a way you can play around gift armories if your game knowledge extends beyond the game.
I have a question about gift armories and double up. Me and my boyfriend always play double up with each other, and every game he goes up to him first. How does it work? It's account ID. We need to be better about randomizing it, but right now it's account ID.
So you can play around who will always go first if you know your teammate's account ID or you've become familiar with who goes first anyway. But this is impossible to account for if you're solo queuing in double up. But who even knows their own account ID, let alone others? And what plays do you do around who goes first with gift armories? Is it just making sure you have enough econ? Anyway, back in the Jan 2022 article where they announced they're keeping double up, they mentioned improvements they want to make. And they have been making some of these improvements like the carousel changes, gift armory changes, tweaks to player damage, and a unified ranking system. But in that same article, they mentioned that they were considering allowing larger lobbies than just 2 players, which would allow you to queue with more friends. They also mentioned the possibility of double up exclusive augments, which would completely transform double up, especially since Riot announced in November 2022 that augments would be an evergreen mechanic in TFT. However, 15 months later, we have yet to see any updates on these potential changes. It just seems that they're only really making 1 or 2 changes to double up each set, which may be due to how small their modes team is.
Yeah, I honestly, it's just a resourcing question of where we want to spend our time. Double up's definitely something we want to give more love to. I would expect some changes probably in the next couple years when we really have more folks working on modes.
I'll cut them some slack considering they've made the jump from making 2 sets to 3 sets a year. But the issue with this change and the dev update is that it kinda left double up and hyperroll players still waiting for news. Some are aware that there are changes incoming, but they have no idea what the changes are or if they're happening anytime soon. And in this dev update, there was no mention if the modes team will get bigger or if the teams or pods for each set will have people working on the different game modes like double up or hyperroll. Maybe I'm wrong in saying this, but these game modes don't really feel like a priority right now because they probably aren't. But maybe there's larger changes right around the corner. But again, they've not communicated anything about this, so I'm doubtful. Essentially, I think that double up has been making small steps forward each set, but the rune change was a massive step back. But double up will never truly be doomed because there is a large part of the player base that really enjoys TFT and wants to play a mode with their friends. This is a genuine need and demand from the player base that only double up serves. And honestly, I think that double up has a really high skill ceiling, even higher than normal, because of the sheer number of things you can do and the sheer amount of possibilities. So there's still a lot of room for the mode and its players to learn and grow. For example, you have more access to units because you're essentially seeing twice the amount of shops if you include your teammates. So this can enable a lot of creativity and the flexibility is astronomical. But I think that this state of double up is the worst it's ever been. And even though it solved a massive issue that was funneling, it's just not nearly as interesting to play anymore because of how reduced the interactions are. It just feels like there's not much difference between playing double up in its current state and dual queuing for normal. Admittedly, the solution to funneling is extremely tricky because it's not like they can change a set designed to prevent it, as in make traits like Brawler and Duelist traits that can't appear in the same set. This is absolutely terrible because it greatly limits a set's design, as these are extremely common and standard classes in strategy games, and they should be in a set together if it makes sense and there's enough cohesion. I personally cannot think of any solution to this problem that doesn't introduce more problems, similar to the Rune Changes, but I have confidence in the TFT team that they'll figure it out eventually. I personally enjoy Double Up the most, and it's a large part of the reason for me to continue playing a set, but the Rune Changes have almost killed that feeling entirely for me, and since these changes, I haven't really played this set nearly as much as I usually would. I just feel like without runes, there needs to be more ways to invest in your teammates' board, and this solution to funneling just isn't it. But yeah, that's my pseudo rant over. Let me know what you think. Do you agree, or was I too harsh with my arguments? Are you looking forward to double up changes, or is the current state right? Anyway, check out these other videos if you want to see more from me. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.